Laura, today we're going to talk about human sexuality and the rights of people with developmental disabilities.
Sexuality? That's a sensitive topic, Greg. Different people have different sexual standards and values.
That's true. But for people with developmental disabilities, sexuality is particularly sensitive because of the concerns that exist about these individuals having children of their own.
What do you mean?
Well, individuals with developmental disabilities were thought to be genetically inferior, as though their disability was programmed into their genes.
Like eye color?
Yes. And it was taken for granted that the developmental disability of the parents would be inherited by the children.
Isn't that true?
No, it's not. You see, most developmental disabilities occur after a normal conception due to factors like drug or alcohol use, infection, injury to the fetus before or during birth.
Well, a disability that occurs after conception can't be inherited.
That's right. Disabilities caused by environmental factors can't be passed from parent to child.
What about a disability like Down syndrome?
Some disabilities are caused by genetic factors, but the same genetic factors that cause the disability often prevent the individual from ever having children.
Oh, so overall, the possibility of a person with a developmental disability having a child with developmental disabilities is small.
Yes, but as a result of this mistaken belief
That developmental disabilities are inherited.
society's done just about everything possible to prevent these individuals from having children. 20th century approaches to the sexuality of people with developmental disabilities can be summed up in 3 words: institutionalization, sterilization, and punishment.
That sounds horrible.
It was a horror show. In the first half of the century, institutionalization was promoted as an effective method of birth control.
Institutionalization is birth control?
It was considered especially important to institutionalize women of childbearing age so that their behavior could be closely monitored.
And they could be prevented from acting sexually.
Yes. In the institution, men and women were segregated. They couldn't live together. They couldn't eat together. They even had to remain a certain distance apart at all times.
That's appalling.
And it wasn't enough to institutionalize and segregate these men and women. They were sterilized, had testicles and ovaries surgically removed without their consent.
How cruel.
During this period, it was illegal in many states for a man or woman with developmental disabilities to get married.
You know, what you describe is really hideous. When did things begin to change?
Well, the first wave of change came in the 1960s. Individuals began moving back into the community from the institution. Sterilization laws were declared unconstitutional.
That's great.
Well, addresses changed, but attitudes remained the same. Behavioral approaches like reinforcement and punishment were becoming increasingly popular to control unwanted behavior. And as you might guess, sexual behavior was on that unwanted list.
So sexual behavior was treated like other undesirable behavior, like physical aggression?
Right. Just like physical aggression, sexual behavior was often punished.
Punished how?
A man or woman engaging in sexual behavior might be placed in restraints or in timeout. To stop someone who is masturbating, an acceptable procedure would have been to squirt lemon juice into his mouth as a punishment.
That's terrible.
And now things are changing again. Courts tell us we can't deny rights, even sexual rights, and punishment is much less acceptable as a means to control behavior.
Well, that's good news.
But the misguided efforts of the past were successful.
How do you mean successful?
I mean that in our society, over 90% of the total population gets married, often more than once. But less than 10% of all people with developmental disabilities are married.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It doesn't stop there. Think about it. Having friends, dating, kissing, going steady, no big deal, right?
Right.
We're adults. We're expected to have romantic sexual partners that we live or travel with. Having a romantic candlelight dinner is special, but not unusual.
Those are pretty common experiences.
For you or me. But these experiences are rare, only to be dreamed of occurrences for most people with developmental disabilities.
I never thought about it that way.
See, this is more than preventing individuals from having babies. This is eliminating their total sexual identities. It got to the point where some individuals didn't know whether they were men or women.
There's got to be a lesson in all this.
The lesson is to not impose our own values, standards, and beliefs on other people because the consequences can be devastating.
How do we begin to reverse this trend?
We start by accepting that all people, including those with developmental disabilities, have certain fundamental sexual rights.
Like what?
like what I call the magnificent seven of sexual rights. Number 1, the right to develop and to relate to others as a sexual being. 2, the right to privacy. 3, the right to be informed. 4, the right to choose your marital status. 5, the right to have or not have children. 6, the right to have access to needed services. 7, the right to make decisions affecting your own life.
So, first is the right to develop and to relate to others as a sexual being.
Yes. By sexual being, I mean a person who has a sexual identity as a man or woman and relates to others comfortably from that identity.
That involves a lot.
It sure does. All the way from understanding sex roles
Roles like husband, wife, father, mother,
to learning specific skills like grooming.
wearing makeup for a woman, and shaving for a man.
It also involves knowing how to look and act attractively. It involves knowing how to relate to others as stranger, acquaintance, friend, or lover, depending on the circumstances.
That is a lot to know. It takes a lifetime to learn.
And for most of us, the learning starts early. It starts at home and continues at school. But for children with developmental disabilities, sex and sexual potential are usually off limits as topics.
So these children miss out.
Sure do. They grow up without the most basic social skills needed to form friendships. They don't know how to ask someone out on a date. They don't know how to act around someone of the opposite sex who's not a parent or a teacher.
It's like still being a child when it comes to social and sexual matters.
Yes. And being a perpetual child means no matter how hard you try, you'll never be one of the adults.
So the right to develop and relate to others as a sexual being means being included in all the sexual learning and development that's part of childhood, teenage years, and young adulthood.
Instead of being left out. Next is the right to privacy. In our culture, appropriate sexual expression occurs
In private.
Privacy begins with intimate personal care taking place in private, away from members of the opposite sex. It means the bathroom door is closed and we wait for permission before entering. It means teaching, dressing, and grooming in private.
That way the individual isn't confused about what's done in public and what's private.
In the past, we set people up to make errors by failing to respect privacy. You know, most sexual behavior errors on the part of people with developmental disabilities comes from doing in public what others do in private.
It's just a matter of doing what's been learned.
Another error comes from treating strangers as friends.
Like hugging when meeting new people and coming on too strongly with people you don't know well.
That's why we're careful about who assists with dressing and personal care.
No strangers.
And we're careful not to misuse actions like hugging as reinforcers,
That's just setting the person up for inappropriate sexual behavior.
while making them vulnerable to sexual exploitation by strangers.
I see.
Related to privacy is private time,
Time to be alone for intimate sexual expression.
and having a comfortable place to go to be private.
So the right to privacy also means affording a person space to express their sexuality in an intimate manner.
Yes. Then there's the right to be informed about matters of sexuality.
You mean sex education?
Sex education is a big part of it. You see, you may be able to go to a book or a friend for information about sex. But those options aren't available if you can't read, or if you don't have access to books on sexuality, or if your friends don't know any more about the subject than you do.
I see. But doesn't sex education encourage sexual activity?
No, and it doesn't trigger uncontrollable sexual urges. It doesn't unduly stimulate people. In fact, knowledge about sexuality seems to facilitate more responsible behavior.
Really? I didn't know that.
Actually, sexual ignorance sets a person up to engage in irresponsible sexual behavior.
Well, that's good information to know for my own children.
As a matter of fact, the less children know about sex, the younger they are to have their first sexual experience.
But won't teaching people with developmental disabilities about sex be confusing and frustrating?
No. And even if some individuals never have the opportunity to marry, have children, or date, just knowing about sexuality can increase self-esteem. And besides, informal sex education goes on all the time, whether we like it or not.
You mean through television, movies, radio, magazines?
Yes. So the issue isn't whether to have sex education. The issue is what to teach and who should teach it.
So what do we teach?
We begin with body parts and their function, as well as hygiene. Sex education includes learning how to act in public,
Including how to find safety if you feel uncomfortable.
even how to ask where the bathroom is. Sex education also means learning to get along with others.
Learning how to share.
It means learning how to say no to touches and to nosy questions.
That's learning to be assertive.
It sure is. And without the ability to be assertive, an individual with developmental disabilities is a sitting duck for being used and sexually abused.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
Sex education involves learning what to do with friends versus what to do with lovers.
Like how we greet friends.
Sex education includes learning how to kiss, learning to ask for a date, and learning what to do on a date. It involves learning about sexual intercourse, birth control, and pregnancy. It involves learning about AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases.
So the right to be informed means learning about all aspects of sexuality,
including responsible sexual behavior. Now, the next right is pretty self-explanatory. It's the right to choose your marital status.
Marriage is normal.
Absolutely. And there's no rule that says individuals with developmental disabilities must marry others with developmental disabilities.
So this right means individuals may freely choose whether to marry and who to marry.
And it starts by encouraging children with developmental disabilities to have the same expectations for a fulfilling marriage as a child who's non-disabled.
Instead of avoiding the issue.
Exactly. Next is the right to choose to have or not have children.
Having children is a major decision.
Yes. And potential parents need to be aware of the responsibilities of raising a child so they can seriously consider whether they want to conceive a child before making love.
You're saying that having children is not a requirement of marriage.
A childless marriage is perfectly reasonable. And the divorce rate for couples without children is actually lower than for those with children.
I didn't know that. But can an individual who can't care for self ever be able to care for a child?
Good question. Some parents with developmental disabilities need a lot of assistance learning to take care of a child. But with support, it's possible. They can be successful parents. After all, parenting's a learned skill.
So this right means that individuals with developmental disabilities decide for themselves whether or not to have a family.
Exactly. Next is the right to have access to needed services available to others in the community. Services to help an individual enjoy sexual rights. You know, we take a lot for granted, like competent medical services.
Oh, sure. Gynecological exams are routine. And when a woman chooses to have a child, she expects to have a caring obstetrician.
Other needed services might be family planning, parent training, access to genetic counseling and AIDS screening, daycare for children, and counseling for individuals, couples, and family members.
So the right to needed services means access to the supports available to others to exercise sexual rights.
That's it. Last is the right to make decisions that affect your life. We've been talking about decisions all along.
The decision to get married, to have or not have children.
But when we try to impose our own sexual values and standards on people with developmental disabilities, our behavior creates a barrier.
What do you mean?
Well, to tell a person that she can't have any male visitors in her room is to block her from making a decision about her own behavior.
She can't choose to have a man visit on her own.
Our job is to educate others and then trust them to make decisions for themselves. If they make the wrong decision, they can learn from it.
It's like you said before. Be there to help the individual work through the consequences of the decision.
Precisely.
So the right to make decisions means that we allow the person room to choose and room to learn from the decision.
That's right. You know, our society has been preoccupied trying to prevent individuals with developmental disabilities from having children.
It got to the point where sexual identities were erased.
And it was all based on a mistaken belief.
That these individuals were more likely to have children with developmental disabilities.
Now we're in a transition phase. We're trying to turn over a new leaf.
By recognizing the sexual rights of people with developmental disabilities.
But it's a whole lot easier to say that a person has sexual rights than it is to help the individual take risks in the areas of sexuality, dating, and the development of intimate relationships.
But that's our job, isn't it, Greg?
It sure is. We're here to empower the individual to make choices that may not be the choices we would make for ourselves. We'll continue our discussion of sexuality next time, Laura. See you then.